analysis. My name is Simon Fletcher. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the Small Cell Forum, and as ever, I'm joined by my partner in crime, Caroline, who's going to be talking me through and teaching me the insights from her analysis. Right, let's get going, Caroline. Good to see you again. And, some really useful insights coming through from this report, I think, again this year. Worth perhaps, before we get into the slides, just understanding the method you're applying, how you're doing the forecasting, response levels, etc., just so we've got some background assumption, understanding on that.
Yeah, definitely. And yes, great to see everyone on the call. Yes, I think my team have been producing this status report and forecast. I think it's about 12 years now. So we're getting quite a body of sort of historic data and enables us to see the trends. But every year we follow the same process. The key input into the forecast is an ecosystem survey that we do, and that the main categories of respondents are mobile network operators, private network operators, and neutral hosts. And this year, that survey attracted 90 responses from 96 unique organisations. Sometimes we get multiple people responding from the same organisation, but so it's quite a comprehensive sort of slice of basically all the types of companies that are deploying small cells. We supplement that with a lot of interviews and so on with vendors, semiconductor suppliers, integrators, the whole supply chain, including, of course, lots of members of the forum. And we interconnect that with data and surveys that we have around enterprise connectivity. All that data and knowledge then gives us some direct results. Survey results, we'll share some today that just show us what the ecosystem is thinking about small cells and what their plans are. We're asking about plans to 2030 to 31 at the moment. But it's also very important feeding into the assumptions for our forecast model, model that we've built and refined ever since we've been doing this exercise. So we feel it's really quite robust now in enabling us to look ahead and see forecast. You can argue with the figures in forecasts, of course, but we are pretty confident about the trends that they're showing. As I say, the more historic data we acquire, the more we can look back at sort of what went right, what went wrong, what's liable to, what are the main risks to our forecast, and indeed what are the main reasons for upside. So we'll talk about that more as we go along.
Yeah, great. And I think maybe just a couple of words from me before we get into the first slide, which just to say, for those of you who are now connected, I see the numbers building fairly quickly. We will have a 10-minute slot at the end for Q&A with the audience, and you can find on the Teams platform Q&A tab, and you can type your questions in there, and I'll get fed, and Caroline will get fed those questions towards the end of the session. So we won't be looking at those questions until we get towards the end, just so you're aware. And I guess the important point that I just wanted to raise here before we move on is to say that this week is in the forum, we have our annual review and AGM activities ongoing for the members. And we have broken out of that for this public briefing, which we try to do each year to share with the ecosystem, the market related insights. But we will certainly, within the forum, we use this as an important indicator of priorities for the work program going into our next financial year for the forum and into 2026. So it's an important data source for us. Okay, Caroline, let's get into the meat of the presentation, start having a look at some of these insights.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the top level forecast, and it's worth reiterating for people who are new to this that the main forecast we do is a unit-based forecast, and the units that we measure are radio units. So that can either be an all-in-one small cell, or in the case of a disaggregated small cell, we're counting the radio units rather than the basebands, which gives us an idea of the locations that these cells are in. So here you can see the global unit forecast. The yellow line is last year's, and the purple line is the one that we've just completed. People who've been following these reports for a couple of years will probably heave a sigh of relief because there's a lot less difference between the 2 years than there was. We had 2 or 3 years when we were reforecasting quite significantly as a result of all the turbulence that we know about, both within the telecom market and also the global issues like COVID and global inflation. And it really was a period of unpredictability, which is always very worrying for any market. And of course, there's been a big squeeze on particularly mobile operator capex in recent years. That's not improving, but the market's used to it now. We sort of know where that's going. We know what the implications are for build out and supply. So we do see that the market is stabilising, which is always good news. It's much more predictable than it was even a year ago. And we are seeing a significant window of opportunity for small cells. So although these bars don't look like they're terribly different, there actually is an improved compound annual growth rate, as far as we believe, of 9.4% between 2023 and 2030. For the same period last year, we were looking at 8.6%. As we'll see later on, that increase translates to quite a large number of extra units. So we are now looking at cumulative shipments of about just over 60 million radio units during this time, which will result in an installed base of about 55 million. Obviously, there's some replacement going on as small cells start to reach more maturity. We are seeing deployments slightly behind what we'd expected in the coming year, but then picking up a lot of pace sort of at the end of 2026 and onwards. So 2027 to 2028 we see as being extremely important, healthy years. There may be drivers or actions that the ecosystem can take to bring this forward a bit. So some of that upside actually, we actually see it in 2026, but we'll talk a bit more about what can improve or indeed reduce forecasts going forward. But we see a peak in 2028 at 9.6 million units, and that's about double the 2023 figure. So this is serious growth. We think that translates into revenues to vendors and integrators by 2030 of about $4.5 billion US per year. There are still some delays in 2025 to 2026, and a lot of that is still the economic climate, geopolitics, and so on. But from 2027, we are seeing this big window of opportunity to kind of outperform from what we'd expected before and achieve that higher level of deployment by 2030. So I suppose that's the overall message, Simon. We think there's a period 2026 to 2028, which is a serious window of opportunity for small cells, and as a community, it's going to be really important that we look at how to capitalise on that before we see the slight drop off that you can see at the end of this graph as operators complete their first wave of deployments and then wait to see what the next generation will bring.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's a discussion that we're having within the forum about what is the next generation going to look like from a forum perspective. We're very much in a trade/deployment oriented model of operations. So we're not driving for the standards in that sense with the very advanced technologies. That's not our role in the ecosystem. We're quite keen on seeing the products and the solutions So we're watching and interacting and collaborating with the large standards bodies, the 3GPP and O-RAN Alliance, and trying to understand how those standard bodies are going to be positioning around the 6G stories. Interesting. I'm guessing that this data was gathered before, because I'm not guessing, I know for sure. I mean, in the last couple of weeks, that there's been a decision coming out of 3GPP around the physical layer, the numerology much the same as what was in 5G. So this sounds like a period of consolidation, perhaps, around the physical layer and the new technologies there, which may, I guess, show through in perhaps next year's market analysis in a further uptick in confidence in terms of deploying small cells, because there's less uncertainty around what the physical layer is going to be for 6G. But let's see how that plays out. But yeah, interesting to see those trends. Let's go on to the next slide, Caroline. So
yes, and I think following on from what you just said, really, this is looking at 5G versus 4G in that the same forecast, but split by the technology. And I think relating to what you just said, we always see this point, the sort of midpoint between two generations of technology is the sweet spot for the small cells, isn't it? Because at the beginning of a new technology, beginning of 5G, all the operators got new spectrum. They didn't have the same capacity constraints. They tended to put their first efforts into enhancing their macro layers, and didn't quite feel the same need for the densification. And then as we start seeing, yes, new applications are driven by the new generation technology. They've been driven by 5G, which need different sorts of build out. They need capacity hotspots. They need in-building coverage and so on. So start to see operators suddenly realizing that those problems are best addressed with the small cells, and as you say, that the sort of stabilizing of the technology itself, more confidence in it. But with 6G being further out, but certainly I think increasingly we're seeing these sort of continuity announcements, and you can debate whether this is the right way or the wrong way, but it certainly gives a lot of confidence to the market that 6G isn't going to be a complete rip and replace, that it's likely to use, as you say, that the same numerology. They're talking about using the 5G core into 6G. And I think some of the really big players like Ericsson are very much pushing that, because they know that operators will feel much more comfortable with that idea.
It makes sense. Having said that, of course, I mean, and this was a thing that we picked up a bit when I did my tour around all these small cell vendors at Mobile World Congress this year in Barcelona. The item that's quite interesting to me is the 5G, 4G combined BTS. And we were hearing from chipset guys that they developed their 5G solution and then were getting requests from operators and others. As a driver, I think, of the refarming of spectrum and the turning off of some of the old legacy technologies, 2G, 3G, that's happening in the market, and trying to have the flexibility in the densified or coverage enhanced areas of their networks where small cells are deployed, where they wanted 4G functionality to be part of the package. And to say, you can see even in 2028, there's 4G, 5G combined BTS is still got some interest there. So, and it's growing as a segment there, isn't it? It's quite interesting to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting point how long 4G persists, and as you say, but particularly with some of the spectrum sharing and spectrum refarming that's going on. So just as you say, 2028 and even 2029, and these, remember, new deployments. So these are combined small cell base stations being put in still with 4G support as late as, well, and going into a reasonably substantial number still in 2030. So I think once 2G and 3G go, I think the 4G 5G combination is going to persist for a very long time, especially
Very powerful.
indoors and in private
Yeah.
networks and enterprise networks.
And that's reassuring, actually, Caroline, because we've got a work item ongoing in the forum at the moment around the 5G enterprise solution space and looking at in-building systems and potentially some enhancements that could be brought to bear in the standards bodies around the 5G enterprise solution space, and how it interacts with 4G. I think is an important element of that, because 4G actually had some quite nice features in the full LTE SAE architecture in the stack and in the gateways that to some extent have been adjusted or missed or got off the radar a little bit in the 5G.
Yes.
I think that, you know, this getting a more coherent view in the transition from 4G to 5G and then consolidating those platforms is the period we're in now. Yeah, so that's very interesting to see it coming through in those numbers there.
I think it is really, I suppose the other thing on that is that even where we're seeing this huge increase in 5G standalone small cells, increasingly, that 5G standalone core is not usually just 5G. There's normally 4G in the core as well. So I think there's lots more mixing, matching between the two technologies than there used to be. And of course, standalone, although as we know out in the macro network, it's been deployed far more slowly than anybody thought. Sometimes it has been driven more in the small cell area because it's so closely tied into enterprise applications.
Yeah, it's an interesting feature. Okay, let's move on to the next area.
Yeah, this is really looking at, what do we need to do? We mentioned that there's a window now, that 2026 to 2028. If the ecosystem does everything right, you could sort of pull that uptick forward, closer to the start of next year. But similarly, there are, of course, as there always are, there are plenty of barriers to outscale deployment in various scenarios. And if those are not lowered, then we can see the forecast being worse. And you can see on the left, this is our best case. The blue line is the one we saw before, the base case. But the best case and the worst case, relying on looking at, well, what happens if certain barriers are lowered more quickly than we expect them to be at the moment, and therefore you get the yellow line, or they're not addressed effectively, and it takes longer to address them effectively, and therefore things are worse than we expect. You can see that the upside is quite a lot bigger than the downside, and that's partly because we're fairly cautious on the base case, we think, but also looking at what work that the forum does or coordinates, and also work of quite a lot of players in the ecosystem. We feel that what needs to be done to really open the floodgates is very well understood now, whereas a few years ago it kind of wasn't. There were lots of discussions about, well, is this a problem or isn't it? We see a lot of consensus about what different stakeholders need to happen in order to really press the green button. So we think there's actually more potential for the forecast to be improved on than the reverse. But you can see there's a lot to play for here. Cumulatively over the period, the gap between the best and the worst is well over 8 million units, which translates to obviously quite a lot of build out and a lot of dollars invested. And the right shows, according to the survey, the main barriers. So we ask the deployers, or all types, the operators, neutral hosts and so on, what are the main barriers that would cause you to delay the rollout that you'd like to do, or not do it at all. And you can see that the top few are operational complexity, when there's so many cells in the network, total cost of ownership of the infrastructure, immaturity in automation, which sort of links to the top one as well. The more you can automate, the better the economics look. A lot also around what's the cooperation, when mobile operators, for instance, work with neutral hosts, what's the risk and reward sharing? Same risk and reward sharing with other stakeholders like property owners or enterprises. And then some that come come every year, lack of clear monetisation in some areas, slow progress in open systems for companies that really want open platforms to help with the economics, concerns about scalability. Site issues, I think it's really interesting how site issues it's still in the top 10, but it's really quite low down. Whereas you'll remember, Simon, even just a few years ago, that used to be top every single time.
Yeah. So a lot of these the large segments here, the complexity issue, the total cost of ownership, automation coming up there. That's interesting because we're within the forum we're thinking more and more about how to make, you can see in the emerging standards and research domain, zero touch systems are fashionable to talk about at the moment, and it looks like the time is ripe for getting those innovations through into these solution areas, isn't it? Because I mean, these barriers here, if you can get complexity down through automation, you're starting to speak into the two big segments there on the yellows and the orange there that you're showing.
Yes, exactly.
And that really could be making a chunk. And luckily, we've got that in hand in the forum, and we're thinking carefully about how to steer the ecosystem through positioning papers and thought leadership there, because I think there's clearly an opportunity. So let's have a think then a little bit about the challenges going forward on the different areas here and the deployers, because this is going to be quite interesting to look at this.
Yes, and I think it's I'm interested in your view, Simon, or the forum's view, because this seems to be the key challenge, that although there is more consensus than there used to be about what the main barriers and challenges are, of course they vary in importance between the different types of deployers. So mobile operators, private network operators and neutral hosts have different priorities and different concerns. And this chart is just looking at the top few of the challenges that we saw on the previous slide, to make the point that the different priorities. So you can see that the neutral hosts, who are in orange, by a long way, their most important barrier is this issue of how do they share risk and reward? How do they cooperate with mobile operators? What's the relationship with the mobile operator in most markets? Whereas the private network operators in blue, they are very, very concerned with automation and operational complexity that you were just talking about. They're going into enterprise scenarios, and they want networks that are extremely simple and easy to deploy and run, because that's what makes the economics work. For the mobile operators, it's much more of a spread. They're sort of worried about everything in about equal measure, because of course they have a much bigger model.
I think that's quite interesting, Caroline. Going for the philosophy about trying to chop off the tall poppies, first of all, I think it's very noticeable that neutral host concern around the risk reward, and there's certainly mileage there in discussions around business models and blueprints for approaches. We have our database of neutral host deployment models within the forum, where we look at case studies that are commercially deployed or can be proof of concept. We prefer to lean towards the proven out successful deployments, and it you can see we're in our discussions at our annual conference, Small Cell World Summit in London. A lot of interest in encouraging local authorities, encouraging building owners to not just be supportive in terms of saying please deploy your systems, but actually let's see some money on the table to help with the capital expense, etc. And I think there are several players out there now that are getting the importance of bringing connectivity in building or near in building. It brings value to the real estate in that location. So I think that there is something there, but it is clear at the moment that, as you say, that risk sharing and the risk reward calculation is top of mind, and it's certainly something that we're well aware of in the forum.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's and this the immature automation. Yeah, I think it's clearly that there's no question that we're also seeing that the management plane, making sure that there is some standardized approaches to how to bring that, so you can bring more solutions to bear there. I think it's part of the agenda that needs to be addressed in the next year or so. Right. So,
Indeed.
of course, it's good to think about lowering barriers, Caroline. So let's have what's driving the progress here, because it's barriers are barriers, but there's other good
Yes.
things to think about and are driving the progress.
Absolutely, because obviously, as you say, you can lower all the barriers or remove them completely, but there's still got to be a reason to spend the money and deploy the network, to make this investment. So this is the question where we asked the respondents what are the main applications for revenue streams that is driving your plans to deploy small cells. And in this, we were looking at a relatively short time period up to the end of 2027, so that we're looking at, well, what's driving fairly short-term plans. And we asked each respondent to come up with the 3 that were most important for their business. Interestingly, this is probably the question where the responses have changed the most since we started doing the survey. The barriers have changed. As I said, site issues and CapEx feature a lot less than they used to. It's much more about operations. But on the drivers, this has changed dramatically, because it used to be all about just decent coverage, often for voice, which of course remains table stakes. But we can see the huge diversity of different revenue streams and opportunities that these deployers are now looking at to justify their build out. So these are the top ones, and a lot of it is very much driven by enterprise. So the top one this year was enterprise hybrid networks, so sort of public-private, enterprise small cell networks, AI services for enterprise. Inevitably, I think AI features heavily at the minute because it's in the front of everyone's mind. We'll see whether that really is as big a driver as people are saying at the minute, but they clearly think that it will be at the moment. Video and XR is always there, but I think also interesting to see wholesale and network as a service models, particularly for enterprise customers, that's come up the ranking quite a lot over the years. Venue networks, I know the forum's done a lot of work in that area. Also private networks, smart city networks. So really the deployers, they are focusing in on some really interesting areas of opportunity, and a lot of them are becoming fairly specialised in one or the other, rather than, I think, perhaps the build it and they will come approach that we saw earlier on in the history of small cells. We'll build a network, it'll give good coverage, and then people will use it. Now they're looking at ways to build it in a way that's optimally suited to something that has revenue attached to it.
Absolutely, to those places, to those environments. I mean, we certainly see we're building a view around as you say, the venue networks. We've had the Stadium Connectivity Forum activity within Small Cell World Summit for a few years now. A couple of cycles with the Saudi Arabia conference, and also in London, looking at venues and stadiums. And you can see what's happening there is that as those platforms stabilize and those capable networks go there, actually there's further discussion then about what are the VR and XR, so the video and extended reality related use cases. So you can start to see synergies between some of these drivers, and you can bring them together actually around some places and some locations and say, yeah, and there may well be some strong AI related. So you can combine some of the columns and these value propositions, and you're creating a compelling case in terms of the driver. I think it's very interesting, and this is the dream. I think we're pretty much there, as you say, Caroline. A few years ago, it was a little bit of infill here for some coverage, and but now these small cells can potentially bring some real value to those locations, and they're in control of the venues, they're in control of the local players in that local economy of that connectivity area. And this is what we were after from a small cell perspective.
Yes, absolutely.
So great to see.
And I think one of the big contributions that the forum has made to driving this interest in very enterprise-centric services is recognizing that needs a different type of deployment model and much more diversity. You can see it here. You know, we talked for many years about enterprise small cells and what they might do for companies, but it was often hard to find a model that suited for actually deploying them and allowing the deployer to make a business out of it. And I suppose what we've learned over the years is obviously the enterprise market is extremely diverse, so there can't be a one-size-fits-all model, and this is quite consolidated. I mean, in the full data set, you see even more granular breakdowns of the different types of companies that might deploy and operate an enterprise network. And this is looking at enterprise networks, indoor or outdoor, come on to some in-building specific, but ones that are primarily used by an enterprise of any kind. And you can see the diversity here. We've split it between enterprises and their integrators deploying for themselves. That's a declining part of the market. Private network operators, of course, including telcos who have a separate private division. The hybrid networks, there's quite usually deployed by the MNO, but with a private partner, quite a lot of growth in that, particularly in 2027, 28. But the big ones really are the vendors or hyperscalers who have platforms to run these networks and can get to a great deal of scale with that. And of course, the neutral hosts, they're the sort of maroon coloured one, and you can see that they have the biggest growth rate, and certainly by next year, it's starting to become the biggest single deployer of enterprise cells. This is by the number of units, and not necessarily the number of networks, but neutral hosts flourish when they're doing ones with large numbers of cells. So as we scale up.
Yeah, exactly, and that helps. And I think this is, I mean, you say, as you say, that the challenge is the diversity here in terms of the different models, but ultimately there are some underpinning architectural choices that allow for enough commonality and commoditization of the platform approach from a neutral host deployer perspective, so they can get economies of scale in their business, whilst allowing for some variation here. Hybrid area is particularly interesting. We're seeing a lot of discussion here in the forum. We've got a couple of members at least who are talking quite aggressively about, you know, how do you do a mixed private public value proposition? How many operators can you have on your infrastructure alongside a private slice, a private offering of a network, using dedicated spectrum for those applications or not, depending on the arrangement and the neutral hosting arrangement, etc. So it's a very interesting area, the hybrid MNO area and the neutral hosting area, with respect to that. Okay, let's keep going. So in building is always the challenge here for the let's have a look how we're doing on in building.
Yes, and I think the work streams that you mentioned earlier, Simon, sort of recognises that private networks and enterprise networks and in-building networks are not all synonymous with each other. They overlap quite a lot, of course, but there may be different requirements and different deployers of these. So this is looking. This graph is looking just at the in-building networks, whether they are private, hybrid, even public in a few cases, and looking at, again, there are different deployers, but the point here really is to show the importance, whoever is doing the deployment, of sharing, and that goes back to this very important challenge of working out sort of reasonably standard ways for risk and reward to be shared, for effort to be shared between different partners, whoever they might be, because it's essential to get to an in-building network that has, you know, sufficiently efficient, is low power, low footprint. You can't have multiple networks in a a confined space very effectively. So here we're seeing the yellow is DAS, which is fairly stable, but the blue band, which is multi-operator networks, you can see growing a great deal, particularly in the last few years. And again, the neutral host model, so a step on from multi-operator, having the biggest growth from 2027, certainly onwards, even from next year. So there are still a lot of single operator in building networks.
A lot of single operator, though. Interesting, still single operator, Caroline. It's
yes.
So it's diminishing as a proportion, maybe, but it's even out to 2030, we're still seeing it.
Oh, you can still see it, and it's sort of a similar size by 2030 to the other categories. So that if you put the multi-operator and neutral host together, obviously they're shared networks, they're much bigger, and plus DAS.
Exactly. Yeah,
but single operators are still important, still there, and of course a lot of pure private networks can be single operator.
Yeah. Okay, so let's have a look at some urban trends, Caroline.
Yes.
This is an area that we picked up when we were looking at SCWS. There was an announcement from a TowerCo neutral host combination, UK deployment, getting quite interested in getting these neutral host outdoor oriented deployments going. Convinced that there's now a viable case here. Linked now, I think we're looking quite carefully at the local authority engagement and how we bring them into helping to shape the technology ecosystem. So that's a initiative that we're working on within the forum. So yeah, interesting to see how this urban build out story is developing.
Yes, it's a really interesting one because, of course, it's as you'd expect, being mainly outdoors. It's much more MNO driven than the enterprise market, but it's really, as you'll know, it's very regionally varied, more so than enterprise networks we find in terms of who's driving it and what will make a deployment go ahead. And often depending on the regulatory environment, but the city regulations, not just telecom regulations, and how much support is there for city projects. We see the huge ones in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, but then US city projects, a lot of those have really waned a lot, and the US used to be driving these sort of MNO-led city urban build-outs, but in our surveys, there seems to be a little bit less around that. So and also I think there's a feeling people sort of think that all urban small cell projects are kind of the same because they're M&A driven, but actually, every city is different. So the neutral hosts are definitely becoming much more important. They're the orange colour here, so you can see again from 20, certainly from next year onwards, they have very significant growth. Still much smaller than the MNO-led ones, as you'd expect in this urban environment, but becoming a substantial part of the market. So over a quarter of units deployed in 2030 in cities we think will be deployed by neutral hosts, and often that is to fill in those gaps where it doesn't make sense for the MNO, or the MNO has other priorities. Yeah,
absolutely. It's very interesting, as I say, that these announcements are coming thick and fast around the TowerCos. I think the TowerCos are interesting dynamic here because they have assets in the cities, but they are have a good relationship with the operators, of course, and can be a player here alongside a sort of more typical neutral host player that is with active equipment. So it's I think a lot of innovation happening around this area now, which is good to see, and taking the load off the MNO stuff to some extent, and allowing others to start to play in that space. So again, justification for our local authority initiatives. I think they're an important part of the puzzle in terms of enabling those multiple stakeholders to come together and come up with a good deployment. All right, let's move on. Time. Open network. I mean, open networks. We love open network talk in the forum, because we're very much about diversification of supply, commoditization. So we want to see the philosophy of open standards and open networks embedded into the future and to the current day. So it's interesting to see how these open platforms are playing.
Yes, I mean, I think we all know that there was a lot of hype around open networks, or particularly Open RAN, and then there was the inevitable sort of disappointment that things hadn't moved as quickly as others had hoped. I think we're now at the point, rather like I said right at the beginning about the industry as a whole, where things have stabilised and calmed down, and there's much more visibility of what's realistic, what are the timescales, there are still challenges to obviously to deploying open multi-vendor networks, especially if they're virtualized. But those challenges are starting to be addressed by vendors and the ecosystem. So we think it's looking a lot more promising. And this chart is looking at deployment of small cell networks that are based on any open RAN standard. So depending which split you're going through, which architecture or so on, but anything that allows interoperability between the various elements. And you can see that really the big leap here is 2027 to 2028. I think at that point, for companies who primarily want to do open small cell access networks because they want to virtualize, that's the sort of turning point year. Before that, probably most of the driver is more about having the open interface so that you can use different radio heads and support some of the disaggregation that FreeGPP has specified. So I think the drivers are changing, but there is quite a lot of progress, and a lot of this in small cells is driven by the enterprise. You can see that the gap between enterprise and urban units is bigger in Open RAN than it is in small cells in general, because enterprise doesn't have that established ecosystem that the urban and outdoor markets tend to have. It's much easier for new solutions and new vendors to be accepted.
Absolutely, and that again justifies our thinking in the forum around how we focus on the enterprise story, and we're working very closely now, thinking about the collaboration and joint work items with the ORAN Alliance. It's an important part of the ecosystem for us. We very much hope that these different subsystems in the small cell space will, prices will come down over time. We know they're a little bit high at the moment, trade-wise. I think there's some feedback from the market that we're sensing that still Open RAN hasn't quite succeeded in getting the unit prices down on the subsystems, but it feels like it's only a matter of time now. We're starting to see, especially when you're seeing graphs like this and seeing the enterprise guys getting hold of the opportunity. It feels like the time is right now to be focused on that agenda, which is good and reassuring to see for us who are doing the planning for the forum activity. Okay, what about other areas of innovation, Caroline? Where are you thinking we may need to be focused?
Yes, because there's so many areas of technology that you can focus on that are interesting, and where I'm sure members are active, and obviously any forum has to prioritise. And also, I think Small Cell Forum has always been very pragmatic about investing time in innovation because it contributes to the business case, not just because it's interesting. So on that basis, a couple of areas that we've certainly pulled out that have become far more prominent in the survey than they were previously are the millimetre wave, or the FR2 spectrum bands, and non-terrestrial networking integration with 5G in particular. I mean, both of these have been talked about for a long time, and I know the forums worked on, particularly on the high frequency spectrum bands for some while, but we're starting to see some real, again, visibility. So thinking of the spectrum, the high frequency spectrum first, starting to see some real use cases being defined that really do need that spectrum, that don't, and operators or deployers starting to say, yes, in this particular scenario, that spectrum would be optimal, would greatly improve the business case compared to doing small cells in a mid-band. And I think non-terrestrial is a little late. It's a bit earlier in its journey, of course, but we can see so much investment and innovation going into that area, particularly at sort of chipset level. And again, just starting to see a lot of deployers quite narrowly defining the use cases and opportunities that would use that technology. So very practical approach to both of these. The graph shows the deployment of small cells in FR1 and FR2 spectrum. You can see that by 2030, we're looking at the percent of the millimeter wave cells being, about 40% of the new cells deployed, not of the installed base. And of course, you need more of them, so it's always going to be a somewhat, skewed percentage because you need a lot of millimeter wave cells for the same area of coverage. But it's still quite a significant figure, and we would only be confident in that figure if we heard enough of the deployers really, as I say, really setting out, well, why would we do this? What's the use case? What's the revenue stream that attaches to doing small cells in that high frequency?
I think that this is for us. I mean, obviously, as you said, the millimeter wave. You published a paper 18 months ago now, and I know that there was some disappointment in the market. I think the US and Korea and Japan to some extent pushed ahead in the early 5G deployments, and maybe you could argue if they had a bit more mid-band spectrum, they wouldn't have been so foot to the metal on trying to make that rollout happen. But you can it's slow and steady, and I think so in particular industry 4.0 applications from our members. We're seeing that space, and the millimeter wave is nicely ticking up. So it's an enterprise driver. And NTN, we just published a short positioning paper, which I see has got quite a bit of uptake and retweeting or whatever the term is from LinkedIn, re-LinkedIning posts. This morning I was looking at that paper has got some recognition of the NTN paper. Why is the SCF taking care of NTN? Well, it's, as you say, Caroline, is clear. I mean, the chipsets, some of the protocols in the layer 1, layer 2 area, reuse of firmware, software in the stack is possible based on what's being specified in the standards, and that's giving routes to market for guys who are developing hardware and software in the RAN. So it's a great opportunity, and we're encouraging our members to think about that. So let's just look ahead in the last couple of minutes, Caroline, before we open for Q&A. What are you thinking? 6G's there in the horizon, but how far off on the horizon? That's the question.
Yes, exactly. And and in some ways, going back to our starting point in this webinar, it's somewhat risky to focus too much on the next G when we've just said that the sweet spot for a technology for the small cell technology is mid-cycle. We need to really capitalize on that opportunity that when we're halfway through 5G before we start getting carried away with developing the next generation. And indeed, the huge majority of deployers, the survey have no current interest in 6G at all. They just want to monetize 5G effectively. But of course, they are interested in what may come over the horizon that will improve their business model and the services they can deliver still further. And of course, vendors, regulators, policymakers are all very actively engaged with what will that next generation look like. As we said earlier on, increasingly it looks as if it will be a continuity play with 5G rather than something that's brand new. But within that, I think there'll be a lot of technologies which are starting to be proven out a bit in 5G, and particularly 5G advanced. And if they do significantly improve matters for deployers, they'll be enhanced further in 6G. So I think at the minute the ecosystem is definitely seeing 5G Advanced as being a dress rehearsal for 6G on the basis that 6G will then be an evolution of that, and there's a lot of sense to that. So within that sort of landscape, 6G, some brand new network, is probably a long way off, but there'll be a kind of evolutionary path that that vendors and operators can follow. And you can see on the graph, these are areas of technology that the survey respondents said that they expected to invest in, additionally to what they have now in 2024. So what they did last year, in other words, this year, and then looking out to 2030. So the orange 2030 gives you an idea of some of the technology components that will probably be part of the next generation that they're already interested in. But you can see that most of these will start coming on stream within 5G generations. So obviously a 5G Advanced Enterprise, RAN, AI control, edge convergence, Open RAN. These are not 6G technologies. These are things that we have now, but we would expect them to be part of a 6G roadmap because of the level of interest among operators, even at this 5G stage.
Yeah, I mean, because given on the previous slide about all the diversity in terms of the potential use cases, the drivers, I mean, this speaks now to this fairly level playing field here across a number of different drivers. Now, a challenge in terms of where to focus investment, of course. If you're developing, if you're a solution developer, many things to choose from, but I guess opportunity there for niches for multiple players, because as overall the market is growing. You showed us that overall trend is the market is growing. So one would expect and anticipate that there will, for end-to-end solution providers, there's more than enough action for regional and global players in this space going forward. Before we get to talk about 6G, there's plenty in the toolkit, so to speak, that needs to play out. The edge convergence area for me is quite an interesting domain. We were discussing in the forum and in our annual review the thinking around the on-premise versus off, how to deal with near edge, far edge, etc. in that architecture. And how the enterprise players are going to impose their views around the security of their combined AI connectivity and compute platforms that they want to use for their to create value in their enterprise operations. So I think that's a particular area of interest that we will certainly be picking up, and it plays to the 5G, the story on the enterprise, 5G Advanced Enterprise, doesn't it? And virtualization still there as a theme. So just to say, Caroline, as we're coming to the last couple of minutes, and to say to the audience, happy to receive some questions as we go into the last stage. I have one question in front of me at this moment, Caroline, which I'll just feed to you. It's actually come through from Vikas in the SCF team, who's very keen on this topic. So I thought I'd do it. It's worth us because it's a topic that we like to discuss a lot in the forum. So did the survey pick up any nuance around the splits for small cell deployment? So it's a very good question. It's something that we keep. We've got, as you know, the darts tool that we use to optioneer to help with thinking about transport for front haul dimensioning, and there's a paper that will emerge from the forum in the next few weeks around the utilization of that tool. But you can optioneer between 7.2 and 6 and 0 and 2 and all the different sort of splits. Are there any hints from you in terms of split focus, or it's still a wide open field?
No, I mean, it's certainly We always do forecasts by the splits and also the persistence of all-in-one cells as well. So that data and forecast is there in the full report that members have access to, but we obviously can't cover all of the report in the webinar. So you can look at that for the detail, but just in general, still very diverse interest, and I think we've always found this. The all-in-one not disaggregated small cells. There's still a very resilient market for those in plenty of scenarios. They remain a good and relatively simple operable solution, but really seeing most deployers considering what splits would be good in different rollout scenarios. So it's not so much that they religiously decide on one or the other, but they will look at, well, this works better if I'm doing a city network, but over in an indoor enterprise network, I might prefer to go with a 6, for instance. So I think we've always seen this, and I think it's more marked than ever, that companies don't want to just commit themselves to an architecture for the sake of the architecture. They want to have the flexibility to be able to deploy different splits and even to move from one to the other within a deployment. And that's still something that there's a lot of demand for, more sort of dynamic splitting, well, not quite dynamic, but being able to move between splits.
Exactly. This is a really interesting trend. I mean, how dynamic you make it as semi-static or static configuration on the splits, and
yes,
how you could evolve the operate during the operational life of the network, and offer a new split configuration if you, for whatever reason, any of us who've worked on networks for a few years will, even though you do your very best to deploy something that's working for those particular use cases on, for the next forecastable couple of years, of course, a lot of the cases for these networks and the neutral hosts are looking at a return on investment over 15, 20 years. It can be. So,
yes,
you need a network that's going to have longevity and it has
yes,
some flexibility, doesn't it?
absolutely.
And worth saying then, Caroline, you said it, and I'll say it again explicitly at the end, that the market analysis that you're seeing here, everyone on this call, is the public domain. Within the forum, we have more data available for our members, and that particular question that Vikas has asked around the options around 3 split, 2 split, etc. configurations is explored in more detail within the forum data and the reports available to the members. So that's just so you're aware, Vikas, you can look at that data. But for everyone else who's watching, hope this has been of use to you. We always get a good rewatch rate on this video when we put it up on YouTube and various other places. So I'm sure you'll be finding this valuable as you think about your strategies for next year. And we certainly use this information from Caroline every year to recalibrate our thinking on our strategy. So Caroline, thank you very much for your time again. Very good report as usual, and we look forward to our next webinar for the small cell forum, yet to be announced, but there will definitely be one along at some point in the near future. We did FAPI recently, and now we've done the market research webinar, and there'll be others along. So thank you, Caroline, for your time, and
thank you, Simon.
Cheers. Bye bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.